Thank you very much for the introduction, Hannes, and thank you everybody for coming today. And we are now in quite an extraordinary period of economic history in that millennials are now said to be the first generation since before the Industrial Revolution that will be poorer than their parents. And this is across much of Western Europe, but actually across much of the Western world as well. And it's now increasingly looking like Generation Z, the younger generation, will actually be even poorer than millennials. So this is a sustained trend. In Britain, analysts sometimes say it's the first time this has happened since the early 19th century. I think you could arguably go back even further than that, perhaps even from the Renaissance onwards. Each generation left the following generations slightly wealthier. And this trend is now going into decline. So the question is this to do with some specific defective economic policy perhaps? Or is there something deeper going on in the West? Is the West perhaps in civilizational decline? And so that's the question I'll be asking today. And first of all, I'll talk through some different theories of the rise and fall of civilizations, and then we can see to what extent they map on to the modern West. So first of all then, Joseph Tainter is worth considering, and he's one of the latest of the people we'll look at today. He was writing predominantly in the 1980s, and in his book, The Collapse of Complex Societies, he argued that as societies evolve, they become more and more complex, they have more and more bureaucracy until they essentially just become sclerotic and innovation comes to an end. So many of us will see familiarities here between what he was talking about and Europe, and frankly also much of the rest of the Western world as well, where innovation is increasingly smothered by bureaucracy. But I think you have to look at more than just this. And so we'll move on to our second thinker today, which is John Bagot Glubb. And he was a British military officer, and he then wrote in his later years about the history of the rise and fall of civilizations. And in particular, he argued that civilization goes through 6 phases: the phase of pioneers, the phase of conquests, then commerce, then affluence, then the phase of intellect, and finally the phase of decadence. And he argued this could be seen in the Romans, different Chinese dynasties, all across the world. And of course this ties into Tainter, because during the latter phases of decadence, what you of course see is this proliferation of bureaucracy to the point where it smothers innovation. But we need to enrich this with some other thinkers. So we'll move on then to Ibn Khaldun, an Islamic thinker from the 14th century. And he studied the rise and fall of civilizations, and he argued that it came down to what he called asabiya, which translates as something along the lines of social cohesion. So when a civilization is growing, it requires shared values in order for it to expand. Now, he was not a conservative in the sense of wanting a static society. On the contrary, he was in favor of dynamic societies, evolving societies. But he argued that asabiya is the glue that holds the civilization together while it's through this process of dynamic evolution. And then when a civilization develops a certain degree of luxury, that glue then weakens and eventually the civilization goes into decline. Related to that then is another thinker called Kenneth Clark. And some of you may be familiar with him. He actually did a BBC series called Civilization in the 1960s, which is available to watch on YouTube, and I would recommend it. It's excellent. And he talks about, among other things, how when civilizations go into decline, there's always a loss of confidence in the values and the culture of that civilization. And of course, that's also something which we can see today across much of the West. But one of the most important thinkers then, which we'll examine today, is Arnold Toynbee. And he wrote a huge volume of books on the history of the rise and fall of civilizations. He studied 26 different civilizations, and he famously said that when civilizations die, they don't die by murder, they die by suicide. In other words, it's internal factors. There may be wars or famines or whatever, but fundamentally it's the decline from within that causes a civilization to eventually fail. And in particular, he said that the decline of a civilization happens when the quote-unquote creative minority becomes a dominant minority. So when a civilization is expanding, the ruling class are like the Medici, for instance. They're funding all of this beautiful architecture, this beautiful art. They're translating great works of literature and this type of thing. And they don't really think twice about it. It's just naturally, it's just what they want to do, is leave this beautiful architecture so that people can still admire it in hundreds of years. But when the creative minority becomes a dominant minority, the political class is really only interested in self-preservation and enriching themselves. They're certainly not concerned with beautiful architecture and that kind of thing. So again, some of you will notice some aspects of this today with our modern Western political class. And so what results from this is cultural stagnation, loss of energy, and really a general failure of leadership. The final thinker we'll consider today then is Oswald Spengler, a German thinker. And he was writing roughly 100 years ago. And he argued that every civilization goes through certain phases. In particular, every civilization has a spring, then a summer, then an autumn, then a winter. And he also argued that each civilization, in a sense, has its own soul, as he put it, or it's something like a primordial will that drives it. So if we take Greco-Roman civilization then, or what he called Apollonian civilization, their desire was to impose mathematical order on the world. So that manifests itself in their architecture, all the perfectly formed pillars in Greco-Roman architecture, for instance. But it also manifests in the sculpture, all perfectly proportioned and so on. Whereas if we take India, for instance, Indian civilization, this primordial will that they have is for transcendence. So Indian religion and philosophy is primarily concerned with transcending the physical world, whether it's the Vedas, the Upanishads, Buddhism, Jainism, or whatever it might be. But that also manifests itself in, for instance, mathematics. So it was Indian civilization that discovered the number zero, in particular the mathematician Brahmagupta, if my memory is correct. And so the Romans and the Greeks would have found the number zero very strange as a concept. But the Indians, with this inherent desire for transcendence of the material realm, they made that very important discovery in the history of mathematics. Then East Asian civilization, for instance, their primordial will, or their soul, what it seeks is harmony with nature. And that obviously shows itself in almost all of the philosophies: Confucianism, Taoism in China, Shintoism in Japan, and even Buddhism actually. In India, Buddhism is effectively a transcendental philosophy, but as it migrated through China and Japan and elsewhere, it became much more about harmony with nature. And so Spengler argued that our civilization now, the modern West, is what he called Faustian civilization, after Goethe's Faust. And so what it desires is infinite expansion. It wants to discover all the theories of science and so on. And in Goethe's Faust, of course, that is the essence of the character Faust, very different from the Faust in Marlowe's play. So if we think about then this idea of every civilization having a spring, a summer, an autumn and a winter, if we were to take classical civilization for a moment, you could think of, for instance, the spring in terms of literature as being the time of Homer and Hesiod, for instance. And then as the civilization moves into summer, you have the great Greek tragedies, Aeschylus and Sophocles, all the way through to the great Roman literature of Virgil and Ovid, for instance. But then, as classical civilization moved into its autumn period, roughly 100 years after Ovid and Virgil, you have Juvenal and Apuleius. And still quite good literature, of course, but most would say not of the standard of Virgil, certainly not Aeschylus. But then, from around 200 AD, probably no one here can name any works of Greco-Roman literature after about the year 200. Essentially, that civilization had lost its energetic soul. It stopped producing culture, And then it was only perhaps 200 or 300 years after that that the civilization eventually collapsed. So this is all part of the civilizational life cycle. It goes into cultural decline, and then that feeds into political decline and economic decline. Now, if we then move to, again, thinking about the modern West, I noted that we're now seeing intergenerational declines in standards of living for millennials and Generation Z across most of the West for the first time in centuries. Now, there have been several books on this. The Rise and Fall of American Growth by Robert Gordon, The Great Stagnation by Tyler Cowen, and also a physicist, an excellent physicist called Jonathan Hubner, plotted the rate of innovation over time. And what all of these books argue is that innovation peaked in the late 19th to early 20th century and then went into decline. Now, you may be thinking, well, come on, Max, what about smartphones? What about flat screen TVs? But actually, if we take a comparison, if we look at for a moment at 1850 to 1920 versus 1950 to 2020, between 1850 and 1920, the world saw the invention of the automobile, the telegraph, the telephone, the computer, the aeroplane, motion pictures, the electrification of cities, Charles Darwin and the theory of evolution, Einstein, James Clerk Maxwell, and electromagnetism, quantum theory, the invention of the radio, the typewriter, reinforced concrete, X-rays, recorded music, and germ theory. And I could go on all day about all of the innovations just in that period, 1850 to 1920. Civilization was fundamentally transformed. In 1850, if you wanted to get a message from Europe to America, someone had to sail across the Atlantic. People were still riding on horseback and lighting their houses with candlelight. And by 1920, this had been completely transformed. But if you think of 1950 to 2020, actually most of the transformative technologies had already been invented in that previous period, whether it was the computer, television, automobiles, or whatever else. So if we think then to map this onto our earlier ideas, if we take Spengler first for a moment then, of course he talked about what he called Faustian civilization. So you could argue that the spring of Faustian civilization was around the time of Magna Carta and Dante, the Divine Comedy. And then as this civilization moved into summer, there was the Renaissance and then the Enlightenment. And then one could see this autumn period starting where this decline in innovation happens. And so we're really talking from the beginning of the 20th century, the 1920s onwards. But I would argue this also can be seen in literature, for instance. So in the 20th century, it's difficult to think of works of literature, especially, let's say, from the 1970s or 1960s onwards, that you could seriously say are as good as the 19th century literature of Goethe, Stendhal, Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, and then the early 20th century literature of Proust and Joyce. If anyone can think of any novels that are at that standard from the 1970s onwards, please do let me know. But also if we think about the harmonic complexity of music, Spengler thought that classical music was the defining art form of Faustian civilization. And so you can look at the harmonic complexity of music, increasing, let's say, from Monteverdi onwards through Bach, Mozart, Beethoven, and then Mahler and others. And I think really the harmonic complexity of music in the West really peaked probably with the symphonies of Gustav Mahler in the early 20th century, where the chromatic scale was pushed to its limits. And then the harmonic complexity of music really went into decline from the 1920s onwards. So that tracks these other declines in innovation as well. And just one last point, I think you could look at architecture in the same way as well. I think most people would agree 20th century architecture does not have the beauty of previous centuries in the West. But even clothes, for instance, if you look at the clothes, particularly that men wore in the 1500s, the 1600s, the 1700s, they were really fabulously ornate. But that also went into decline with the men's suit in the 20th century. And interestingly, the Jungian psychologist Marie-Louise von Franz argued that during periods of high culture, actually men tend to wear more ornate clothes than women. So during the Italian Renaissance, Elizabethan England, the Enlightenment in Western Europe, and so on. Now, I'm not necessarily putting forward that point of view, but I thought it was a very interesting tie-in to this. And so to conclude then today, as we look at this extraordinary decline in living standards from generation to generation, yes, of course, a lot of it is down to the amount of bureaucracy. Yes, of course, it's down to our feckless political class that have become a dominant minority rather than a creative minority, as Toynbee would say. But it's also not just economics. I would argue really what we've seen over the last 100 years or so is also a decline in the quality of architecture, music, literature, science, and perhaps even clothes, as I briefly mentioned there. So thank you very much, everybody.